There you go. Thank you.
Excellent. That must be Joe doing that. Welcome to this DPN webinar together with OneTrust and the panel that I will introduce shortly. Today we're going to talk about, in the next hour, how to create meaningful data protection impact assessments. I'm going to hand over to Simon to go through the next slide. Over to you, Simon.
Great, thank you very much, Robert. It's good of you to click those for me. I seem to be having a little problem there, so apologies. Just to introduce who we are, if you've not joined us for a webinar before or any of the other things that we do. So we're Data Protection Network. We're a data protection consultancy, kind of helping organisations in all sorts of different sectors, both large and small, solve their data protection kind of challenges and privacy requirements. We also kind of have the insight kind of part of our business, our website, which is pretty well known, I'm sure. Yeah, also it might be worth me just mentioning that we produce these topical articles, how-to guides, etc. And we've got a new kind of how-to guide about assessing the risks from a personal data breach, which will be coming onto the site in just a few days if you're interested for that. We also provide kind of training workshops for teams that handle personal data. These are always kind of practical, engaging sessions where we use relevant examples wherever we can to kind of bring it to life and improve the learning experience for people. And of course, in addition to that, we run a range of different kind of events like the one that we have today. So we've got another webinar coming up soon as well about how to revive your records of processing activity. I just thought I'd mention that. That's also on our site if you're interested, coming up in April. So that's kind of about us, DPN. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, just because we'll kind of all introduce ourselves. So I've worked in data probably for a bit longer than I care to remember, to be honest. First in kind of marketing and commercial roles in the publishing sector, where I kind of used to kind of grow customer volume and value for a media company. In 2015, I kind of switched over to the other side, really, and became a data protection consultant, and I've never looked back really since then. Obviously, I'm now a partner at DPN, and I enjoy helping a wide range of different kind of businesses, say, with their data protection and privacy. And I regularly kind of host training workshops and things for DPN, but also I'm a course tutor for the IDM as well, the Institute of Data and Marketing, on their responsible marketing course. So that's me, and that's DPN. I'll hand you back to Robert.
Thanks very much, Simon. And I just wanted to introduce our sponsor, OneTrust, for today. As you all know, OneTrust is the #1 fastest growing company and focuses significantly on privacy and data protection compliance solutions, with more than 10,000 customers, half of them being global Fortune 500. OneTrust has solutions across privacy, security, data governance, third-party risk, ethics and compliance, and ESG programs, the latest wonderful acronym. In terms of the panel today, Simon's introduced himself briefly. I'm going to moderate today's webinar. I'm an advisor to the board of the Data Protection Network Associates. I used to be a lawyer in private practice, but recently left and now run my own data protection, compliance and ethics organization. And that's me. So I'll ask Debbie to introduce herself, please. Debbie, over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Robert, and lovely to be invited to talk here today. I'm currently the Group Data Protection Officer for a company called Rentokil Initial, which operates in over, oh gosh, I've lost track now, but over 85 different countries, very acquisitive. And I'm currently responsible for basically making sure all the countries all over the world comply with various data protection requirements. My previous was a barrister many years ago now, and was very interested in surveillance and human rights, etc., and security, cybersecurity, cybercrime, and that led to various roles in the sort of technology sector and where I am today. So I've got over 20 plus years experience in this space, and hopefully some of the insights we discussed will be useful.
Thank you, Debbie. And over to Joseph, please.
Thanks, Robert. Nice to hear from Debbie as well. Great to be back at another DPN event, one of several that I think I've done over the past few years. So I'm Joseph Byrne. I'm a Principal Solutions Engineer at OneTrust. So there's two sides to my role, really. I work with prospects and clients to show them how we can address their privacy requirements with OneTrust. But I also speak at a lot of industry events and do keynote speeches around the subject of privacy. In fact, last week I was in Dubai at a government conference speaking about compliance and governance and how automation can help. So it's both parts really. It's product and it's also industry knowledge. So delighted to be here talking about DPIAs today.
Thank you very much, Joe. And Simon, are you happy for me just to do an introduction of the agenda and then I can hand over to you for the poll?
Yep, sounds good. Yep, go ahead.
So what we're looking to do here is a quick recap on DPIAs, discuss what an effective process looks like, look at assessing and rating privacy risks, implementing the actions, future role of DPIAs, and then we've got questions from the audience. Simon's got some notes that he's made, and I think I will pass over to him. And also, before we get into the Q&A, we've got some polling questions for you. Also, I might just say throughout the entire rest of this presentation, if you've got questions, please do send them in using the Q&A box on the screen. We've got lots and lots of questions, so no problem in filling the time. In fact, we're going to struggle to get through everything. So I'm going to hand back to Simon.
Great, thanks, Robert. Yeah. So just to if you can just click the next button for me, if that would be all right, Robert. Yeah, thank you. We're just going to start with a very quick recap. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but kind of what is a DPIA? Obviously, it's a very useful risk management tool. The aim is to help you to identify and to be able to assess and minimize then any risks that you have, data protection risks that you identify in a project, on a new process or a service. The key thing is it does need to be conducted before the processing begins, rather than starting off the processing and then do the impact assessment. It's important to do that before it starts. It should be a flexible and scalable tool that you can apply to various different kind of projects and activities across a business. There's no point having a very rigid tool that's not flexible to the different ways that people work and the different kinds of projects. So I think that's a key thing. It helps you to evaluate the different kind of risks that you may face from a privacy perspective, and to determine kind of whether that level of risk is an acceptable one in the situation. And if it's not an acceptable level of risk, then to identify different ways to mitigate it. There is no specific template that you have to use. So there obviously are a range of templates available from the supervisory authorities and from the ICO in particular. There are DPI templates you can use, but you're not fixed to one particular one. You can develop your own as well if you wish. And obviously the whole process is to help you be able to demonstrate that you can comply as well with the data protection and obligations. So in terms of thinking about things like the accountability that controllers have, and also privacy by design links into those areas. Could we just click the next slide, please? Thank you. So in terms of the situations when we need to conduct DPIA, this is actually based on the latest ICO guidance, and we've just kind of created this into an illustration. So there's a range of things that, again, for many of us may be quite familiar. So there's innovative technology, denial of access to a product or service, large-scale profiling, which I'm sure we'll probably talk about during the course of this, what large-scale means, biometric and genetic data, matching data sets together. Invisible processing, which I think is one that I find comes up fairly regularly, actually, where individuals are not aware of the processing and therefore the implications that causes, tracking geolocation behavior, and then targeting of children or other vulnerable individuals. So those are the latest guidance on when there's likely to be a result in a high risk, and therefore a DPIA should be conducted. Show the next one. So in terms of the challenges, and this is kind of, I think, where the focus is for us today, is being able to understand the different ways of working and a good way to manage the process. But the kind of challenges that we often find that businesses are dealing with are, first of all, getting some visibility on what projects are coming up within a business. Particularly, I think in larger businesses, that can be a bit of a challenge to just keep a handle on it. Deciding whether a DPIA then is required, or in fact, even if it's not mandatory, whether you'd like to carry one out as kind of a risk assessment methodology to get on top of any risk that might be there. Getting your stakeholders to engage and to actively play a part in the process can be a challenge in some situations. So I think we'll have a few tips that we talk about there. Obviously, being able to then assess the privacy risks and to be able to manage that whole process in a nice, efficient, timely way. And obviously, at the end of it, we've got to make sure that we gain the commitment to be able to tackle any risk that we identify, and to make sure that we get some solutions in place. And obviously, at the end of it, being able to review the process and be able to make sure that we've that it's gone as we expected. And that's it. I'll hand back to you, Robert, for the Q&A and the poll.
Do we want to do the polls, Simon?
Yeah, let's do that. I think, unfortunately, we'll have to need to just click off the slides and pop the poll up because, unfortunately, my cursor's not working on that. My apologies. Are you able to just click the slide button, Robert, switch those off and pop the poll on?
Slide button is where?
On the right-hand side. I'm sorry about this, everybody. We've got a problem with this.
Okay.
That's it. And then the poll button's just above it. You can see it.
Right.
And you should be able to publish it.
Yeah. So we're looking here at what is your main challenge with DPIAs. And I can see everybody is working on, and in fact, even as I'm talking, the percentages are changing. So I'm just going to give it a little bit longer to settle down. And I think it will be instructive to see what the results are here, because it's probably going to lead almost to my first question that we've had in on staff engagement. So I think we're probably just about settling down here, everyone. So I'm gonna end the poll, but what we look like we've got is about 57% say staff engagement is the biggest challenge, and then the next one is the actual assessment process itself, and then deciding when a DPIA is required, and then mitigating the risks. Thank you, everybody, for doing that poll. That's perfect. I will now go back into the slides, I guess, Simon.
Yeah, thank you. You probably don't need the slides, to be fair. Now we can just talk through, actually, because we've just got okay. Q&A, haven't we, now?
Well, I'm going to leave that up now that I've just put it back up again. So as we saw there, getting engagement seems to be one of the biggest concerns. And we've also had questions in, particularly around that, which is, from a challenge point of view, how do you get staff to engage with the process and also the principles of the DPIA? I'm intrigued, Debbie, as a DPO, how have you tackled this? Has it been a challenge? And if it is, how did you get round it?
So it's an excellent question, and it is a challenge. And it's a bit like, I suppose, if you're a finance person, if you hold the money, people can't spend things without the approval of the finance person, because there is a process for it. They know it'll get pushed back, because without the approval of finance, oh, shock horror, they can't suddenly go off and buy stuff. And so, you know, with any organization, you have to find the best way of handling it. Obviously, organized finance functions have usually got that established very early on, because they are in control of the money. And we're not necessarily, as DPOs, in control of the data, but we are, you know, able to manage the process and educate people on the process and try and influence cultural change. So what I tend to do in all the various companies I've worked for and the recent place is make sure people understand the importance of that process, take responsibility for the data, understand that there are steps that need to be taken. It's not just a tick box exercise. It's a requirement. It needs to be done, and it's leading them into it in a gentle way as well, because people don't always like being told what they have to do, because people will rebel. So you have to sort of coerce people into this sort of way of working, and and get the buy-in of senior people, get the buy-in of people who are managing processes. It's a real sort of it's not a quick fix. It's a long journey, but once you get people coming along with you, it does become easier.
So I'm assuming you've never come across what I did, which was one particular company where the marketing team decided that to actually reduce the burden, they would do pre-completed templates.
Oh my God. Yeah. So I haven't seen that, but smart people, right? Not really. Yeah. No, I have seen some horrors. I wouldn't dare say where and where, who's done that. But yeah, occasionally people do think they know the answer to these things. And the stuff I have read has been quite shocking. But we've got we do actually, I hate to plug. Sorry, I'm going to plug OneTrust, but we do use OneTrust. I hate to plug anything, but that has helped certainly in terms of making sure people follow a process. They use a template, they use the tool, so they can't go off and pre-populate stuff, because that tool does require, the way we've set it up requires people to put in some, unique answers, let's put it that way, or various statements, not just, templates they want to copy.
And just sticking with you, Debbie, have you found that you've learnt from some of the DPIA processes, and have you sort of fed that back into the manual or the policy for the future?
So the challenge you've got is, so I've worked for a range of sectors, and some sectors, in my view anyway, require more rigorous DPIAs. They require more detail in them than others. And so there is no one size fits all. You've got to kind of see how your organization works, what space you're in, what risks that exist. Also understand the risk appetite of the business as well. So I wouldn't like to say there is a silver bullet, because there is not. But there are certainly things I've seen work well and things that don't work well. And I've certainly seen some companies, they've just got full-time resources doing these things. And I feel really sorry if you're on the call and that's what you do. That's got to be pretty dull, because that is quite sorry. But that's, that is all they do all day. They'll be experts at it. And so they can probably tell us more about it than anybody else. But, it can be quite an arduous job. And I think there are better ways of doing it. I'm sure we'll explore those as we go on with the session. But yeah, I think each company is different. And that's what I would take away, is don't assume that one approach will work everywhere, because it won't.
Sure. And I'm actually going to just turn to Simon. As Debbie's been talking, we've had a comment in which I think is spot on here. I think the main challenge not listed is gaining visibility of projects within the business. So, Debbie's been talking about getting engagement and buy-in, but how do you actually, if you're the DPO or you're responsible for this, make people realize they've got to give you advance warning of what's happening?
Can I answer that one as well? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, please.
I'm sorry, because I actually sit on all the project governance calls as well. And again, that's something DPOs need to do. As soon as they find out that there may not be project governance calls, but most companies will have some element of a project review, even if it's just to spend money. So either get very friendly with the finance person, because they will know about all these things, because usually projects involve money, or get onto a project governance, committee, call, whatever they're called, and make sure that you start asking all the right questions of all the people that bring these projects up for review or whatever. I mean, the types of review processes for projects will vary from company to company, but guaranteed there will be someone who knows about them, usually finance, but you might be able to explore other avenues as well.
Okay, so yeah, sorry, back to you, Simon. Any thoughts there about how you get the
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree with everything that you've said there, Debbie. But I guess the other bits that I'd probably add in terms of, in my experience, yeah, finance were absolutely one of the teams that I would talk to, and the governance bodies. But the other ones that I found quite helpful were one, if there was the IT team, obviously, and particularly IT security. So often, if there's anything involving data, the IT security team may well be, approached before a data protection or privacy team. So sometimes they can give you a heads up on projects, and vice versa. Equally, you can give them a heads up on things that they may not be aware of. They were certainly an ally. And the other one I'd mention was procurement. Quite often, again, if there's a spend coming up, procurement are going to hear about it fairly early. And generally, I found it quite useful to give those teams a little bit of training, a bit of more understanding, so that they can recognise projects that might involve personal data, and therefore can first mention it to the stakeholders involved about whether there might need to be a DPIA, and can give you the heads up. So yeah, and the PMO team, again, if you have a project management team, people like that, they've really, I think it's just about making sure that you're really in line with all these different people, and that they understand the requirements and can flag things up to you nice and early. Because the danger is, of course, if people don't, and this unfortunately can happen all too often in businesses, is that you get to hear about a big project far too late in the day, and therefore it can result in delays and things, and that's the last thing anybody wants. So we want to be helping the business to find solutions rather than causing delays.
Thank you. Joe, anything you want to add at this stage?
I think absolutely. And as a DPO, you need to try and position yourself as an enabler within the business rather than a blocker. I mean, there's obviously a challenge in doing that, so that people don't then try and stealthily get their projects underway, avoiding you. And a point Debbie made as well is very valid. You need to be aware of your organizational culture. So at the start of my career, I worked in an oil company where everyone did what they were told 100% of the time. If it was policy, it was law. Or even if they had a social event, everyone turned up because that's what we were told to do. And in other organizations, people do exactly the opposite. So I think you need to be aware of what sort of organizational culture you have, and then maybe balance your strategy around that.
Okay. And there's a fundamental question that we've got here, and I'd love to chip in a minute on it, but I'm going to ask Debbie. So the question here is, have you ever felt like you've achieved true impartiality for a DPIA, and has it actually changed the shape of the project?
I'd like to think so, but I mean, maybe I'm not being impartial. But has it changed the shape of the project? I think it hasn't necessarily changed the shape of the project. I think it's changed some of the outcomes and the deliverables of the project. I mean, you know, that would be my objective, not to change it completely. That wouldn't be right, but absolutely to make sure that, you know, the business stakeholders involved understand some of the risks and are actually a bit more proactive about how they're implementing, you know, data protection and managing the data, etc. And absolutely, I'd like to think that I'm impartial, but, you know, I'm quite pragmatic as well. But, you know, fundamentally, I want to make sure everything's done in the least risky way possible.
I mean, picking up on when Simon was introducing the topic, you talked about risk management, or it's a risk management tool. And I was going to say, I had an interesting one a few years ago where as external counsel, I got a phone call from compliance of a pharmaceutical company where the compliance guy said, our IT and our medical regulatory team have decided that rather than managing patient data internally, we're going to outsource it. They found a cloud solution which saves so much money. And we started the process of why are we doing this, et cetera, and given that it was patient data and so on, by the time we'd worked through the DPIA and we'd put in place, or we'd priced up the checks and balances to manage the privacy risks, putting those in place was 3 times more than the savings that apparently we were going to make. So the outcome was we are not moving for the time being where we host the data. It's too risky. So I think that was a really classic example where probably somebody did think we were the business prevention unit, but I think we actually managed a significant risk. And I want to move from that to another question that we've got, which I think is, I'm going to go to Simon for this. So several people have asked about good templates to follow. And the question that I'm reading here says the ICO accountability framework says, if the screening checklist indicates you don't need a DPIA, you document this. I'm interested if you could expand firstly, Simon, on what's the role of the screening process or the pre-DPIA process, and how do you do that, and the why and the wherefores, please?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Robert. I think it's one of the key challenges is working out when should we conduct a DPIA, and again, it does depend on the organisation and the nature of their processing and the risks and the things involved. So it'll be different for each organisation, but in my experience, it's very good to have some kind of screening process, which may be a templated based thing, in terms of asking specific questions that, based on the feedback that you get to those questions, will help you to decide whether a DPIA is likely to be required for that project. Or in many businesses, that will just be a short scoping call where you've got your predefined questions and you just have maybe a 30-minute chat with the stakeholders so that you can make an educated view as to whether actually you need to go further and conduct the assessment. Because on both sides, you want to make sure that you're covering your risks from the point of view that you don't want to miss a DPIA for a project that really needs one. Equally, in my experience, I find that sometimes DPIAs are done where you don't actually need it, and you identify that actually the risk is very low. And within the acceptability limits of the organisation. So yes, it is relevant, I think, as Debbie said, to what's the risk profile of the organisation and the attitude to risk in the business. But having some kind of process, either with a template or with a call, to just initially spend just a little bit of time just for working out, should we go any further? Should we do a DPIA? And then, of course, coming out of that, you can decide which kind of template you want to use. Are we going to go down a full detailed template and spend a lot of time on this project, or are we going to do a light touch? So sometimes we'll use a kind of a light touch DPIA style template. And then if we identify risks, might take it further from there. But it gives you a bit of flexibility, I think, and helps to save time.
Yeah, and Joe, is this something where it's a typical sort of automated template that you provide as a solution?
Yeah, absolutely. We have an ICO DPI template, and the first section of that asks questions to determine whether you need to do the rest of it. So that really, really streamlines the process of determining whether you should do one or not. And then when it's complete, you have a record of the justification. You can do that in other methods with a document or a spreadsheet, but they're sort of more cumbersome, prone to error. So yeah, we have a template for that exact scenario.
So actually this dovetails with a question that's just come in. Shouldn't companies be using a rating tool to decide if a DPIA is needed rather than asking stakeholders? I'll give that to you, Joe, again.
I think it would certainly help, because you would typically end up with a more objective answer if you have a tool, a template, or an assessment, rather than engaging individuals. And they may, rightly or wrongly, be influenced if you ask them just for their thoughts as to whether they want the project to complete or not. So I think if you have it in a more managed process, you're reducing some of those issues. And equally, as a result of the outcome of that assessment, you can also flag risks. The methodology we have in place shields that section, the downstream actions, from the respondent, so the respondent doesn't get to see the consequences of the answers they're putting in, so that they're not influenced. So I think it's a good comment, a fair comment, and if you can take that away from just conversations with people, I think you'll get a better result and a better indication as to whether to proceed.
Okay, and there's a question come in a little while back, and when Debbie, you were talking about engaging with the business, here we've got somebody who said, management needs to support the DPO. Regrettably, my last 2 roles were in firms where management believed that compliance was either a blocker or just a tick box exercise. So how do you engage management at the top to get the resources and the support, Debbie?
So I think it's how you come across, and obviously depends on the organisation as well up to a point, but you nobody likes being told what to do. No, well, not everybody, some people do, but rarely the people at the top level like to be told what to do, because that's why they've had to get up at the top. So there's an element of, I suppose, sales, negotiation, influencing, all of these good things. And, you have got to sell it a bit. You've got to sell it. I mean, yes, you can go in saying, oh, you've got to do it because otherwise big fines. People at the top level don't really care. I say that, that's not going to work on them. That, they've been there, seen it, done it. So you have to explain some of the value in doing this, what the benefits are, how it will enable business, how it will make things go smoother, how it will make customers happy, how will it make staff happy, how it will, all the benefit. You've got to give it the pluses, not just the negatives. Obviously there are negatives, but you have got to sell it to them. And that takes time. You have to build relationships up with these people. You have to, I have to have regular calls with these people. I have to get to know them. They have to get to know me. They need to know that I'm not just, I've got to be careful what I say here. One of my sons is a bit of a hypochondriac. He's always, saying he's got illnesses, and he hasn't, but sometimes he has. And then, and it's a bit like, if you're going to get the attention of the senior people, you have to go there with genuine issues and not just complain about everything. Otherwise they won't take you seriously. Sorry to use the analogy about my own kid, but you want to make sure that people are bought into it because they respect that you're only going to make a scene if it's essential. And so, getting a process bought in requires real, it does require a bit of effort. Yeah. And you'll get there, but you have to be quite, determined, but do it in the right way and not just why, you've got to really go in nice and easy.
Okay. So I'm gonna move on. So in one of the slides that Simon was using, when we look at the typical DPIA process, and certainly, what the ICO and others recommend, let's assume we've done our pre-screening and we've decided, yes, we need to move into the DPIA. We've obviously got to ask ourselves, what is this project seeking to achieve? What is it that the business is looking to get out of this? But then we've got to ask ourselves, what are the risks associated with this project? And we've had a comment or a question, is a privacy impact assessment a good way of determining if a data protection impact assessment is required? I'm not going to ask for an answer to that, but I do think it does flag that when you're doing the assessment, it's not just about how do we manage compliance with the data protection law, it's how do we uphold the implicit human rights of individuals who may be impacted by the new monitoring tool we're using, or the new robotics we're about to do, or the AI, etc. What I'm interested here, Simon, is from your experience, as you flag the risks in the process, do you find that you have to, what I would call, step out of the DPIA and say, actually, what we're looking at here is a legitimate interest query, or what we're looking at here is a, using international data transfers? Is it a multi-risk assessment? Is, I guess, the question.
I think that's a good point, Robert. Yeah, because it's just one risk assessment technique. It's a really important one, but you're absolutely right. We've got where it's legitimate interest, you may use an LIA, legitimate interest assessment, which takes you through a slightly different process. Or you're right, it can lead you into other areas. Yeah, it's not standalone in that regard. I think I've seen situations where I've started on a DPIA and then it moves into a very specific area that you need to focus on, and vice versa. In fact, where you can be talking about a specific issue and you identify that actually you need to carry out a DPIA. I think the other thing that it made me just think of there is when you were talking about the kinds of risks and the kind of harms and things like that. I think we should just probably spell that out a little bit for our audience and talk about what kind of damage and what kind of harm we're talking about here as well. So to be honest, I don't normally like to mention the recitals and GDPR very much, but there is one thing that I think really helps us in this regard with DPIAs. And a recital 75 this is, which particularly is the bit that talks about risk assessment regarding severity and the likelihood of this happening. And this is where we get the specific examples from as well of what kinds of harms and risks we're talking about here. So that picks out things like discrimination of individuals. It talks also about identity theft and fraud, talks about financial loss, damage to reputation of individuals, loss of confidentiality of personal data, particularly people that are protected by professional secrecy, or any other kind of significant economic or social disadvantage. So I think it was just worth mentioning what kinds of harms we're talking about here. But I also agree with you that it is broader in terms of assessment. So the other thing I'd probably add into that, which I'm sure you buy into too, Robert, is considering it from an ethical point of view as well. Just because we can do something, is it the right thing to do? So yeah, looking at it more holistically, I think is a good thing to do, providing we focus on what those harms to the individual can be.
And do you feel, Joe, that if you've done the DPIA and all does not go according to plan, that the existence of the DPIA is of value if the ICO starts asking questions?
I think certainly, because it shows you've done to the best of your efforts, your due diligence. If something goes wrong after the fact, or maybe it was something you missed or something like this, if you've got nothing, then it just looks like you've been entirely negligent. If you've shown that you've gone through the process, you've perhaps it's identified some risks which you've attempted to mitigate, and unfortunately one of those has still become a problem. At least you've demonstrable work that you've tried to manage that. If you've done simply nothing, you're very much on the back foot, and they may throw the book at you.
Okay, and your thoughts on that, Debbie?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously we recommend it for the same reasons that Joe just highlighted as well. It does demonstrate an element of due diligence, which helps in the event of any sort of issues that may or may not arise. We do get audited occasionally, and again, having those in our back pocket does help demonstrate that at least we understand what we're supposed to do when required, etc. So yeah, it's definitely beneficial to have it.
So we know that the DPO has to be involved and might indeed say, we've reached a point where I think the risk is such that I need to consult with the ICO. How do you explain that again to management, that is what you're there to do, Debbie?
Again, it's awareness, education, getting them to recognise the impact if we don't do it. Yeah. So, yes, I don't want to be the sort of worry wart in the business, but if there is something that could be a serious issue, if it's not escalated, if we can't mitigate it. To be fair, I haven't had to do that yet. So, I haven't got any experience where I've had to go to the ICO and say, look, here we are. Here's something we couldn't manage. I'm sure that will happen at some point, but I haven't to date. I don't know if anybody else on this call or anybody else here has had that. But absolutely being very transparent with, any business stakeholders about the need to go that far if required. Yeah, I'd be fairly confident and comfortable to do it if required.
If I can maybe chip in at that point, if that's okay, Robert. Yeah, sure. I'm with you on Debbie. I'm probably one of those sad individuals that did spend quite a while doing lots and lots of DPIAs. Sorry, sad's not the right word, but one of the individuals that did actually spend a full focus of time doing lots of DPIAs for one client. But the impact was that none of those actually had to be escalated to the ICO, because the situations that you would escalate to the ICO is when there's when you when there's a high risk, you've identified a high level of risk, but it's something that you can't mitigate. You haven't found any ways to mitigate. Well, I'd push back on that and challenge on that. There's usually a way to mitigate the risk. If you just look at different angles, find different ways to do it. And so I'd be looking at all the different possible solutions and different alternatives, minimizing the data, improving the amount of transparency you can give. There's a number of different ways that you might tackle a situation. And so far, in all the different various, must have done at least 50, 60, 70, something like that, DPIAs in the past, never found one that actually needed to go to the ICO. I'm sure that always could happen, but in each case managed to identify different techniques and solutions, ways to actually tackle risk levels.
Thank you. And there's a question come in, and again, I'll just stick with you, Simon, on this first. I'm curious to know how much external resource people use when completing a DPIA. You can make a number of judgment calls as an organization, but at what point do you consult with people outside the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. It can always be important. And I think particularly if you're working with a technology partner, or it involves third-party data sources, or a processor that you're working with, then absolutely essential to be working kind of hand in hand with them. It's really important, I think, in those. But are you thinking of data subjects here, Robert? Or
No. Well, I think I was just going to add to what you were saying, and I would assume that if you're using a third party to help you develop whatever the solution or the project is, would you not ask them if they've carried out a DPIA on the provision of their solution? That I was just going to say, is that something that you've advised your clients as a controller to do, Simon?
Good point. Yeah, absolutely. If there's situations where an organisation is providing a service to you, then yeah, the absolutely first part would be to ask for a copy of their DPIA, and actually just it can be quite revealing if they've done one or not, depending on the type of processing. That in itself might tell you something, and the quality of the DPIA that you then receive back.
Yeah, absolutely. And just sort of adding to some of the things we've said earlier, that it's generally about managing risk. Debbie, have you found when you're dealing with this situation with a processor that you also want to know how will you help us manage privacy by default?
100%. I'm having a few exchanges at the moment with a number of processors, but not just the DPIA piece, also the transfer impact assessment piece, which I know we're not covering today. But anything that will help me get the job done internally is a bonus, and it can be challenging getting information out of the processors, during the sort of contract negotiation phase, which can be very frustrating, especially if their service is supporting data and helping you. You'd expect them to be able to sort of churn this stuff out. So it is a bit of a challenge. I'm sure other people have experienced that as well.
Yeah, and I know we're not here to talk about data transfer assessments, but again, much like Simon and I were saying that you step out to do an LIA, again, you might well, in the course of your DPIA, and the ICO's made it absolutely clear that it's one of the trigger issues, yes. Is there an international data transfer? Where is this stuff being hosted or analysed, etc.? And I'm wondering, Joe, when we look at the solutions, are you finding now that you're creating DPIA as part of the entire risk assessment approach? If we've got to do LIAs and privacy by design and international data transfers, and then if we're dealing with vulnerable people and we've got the online harms, we're going to be doing children's assessments and vulnerable. Aren't we heading towards risk assessment or assessing the assessments? Isn't that where we're at?
Ultimately, yes. And as you noted, there would be potentially for any given, let's say it's a process that we're looking to do, any number of assessments, and they will all generate their own risks. But what we can do is show an overall view of all of the risks that have been generated from those assessments, so you can start to manage them. And then you can also see with OneTrust if the whole process is presenting too much risk. So I think that's definitely the direction it's going in. The most important thing is having the visibility of everything overall.
Okay. As you get to the end of the cycle of the DPIA and you come to sign off, Debbie, do you regard that as the end of the process?
No, not really. I mean, we constantly review things. I mean, we're resource constrained, but we have a process in place to review everything, because otherwise, things change, and a DPIA completed 6 months ago might not be the same today. So whilst we're not checking everything necessarily that often, because to be fair, it's on an annual basis, we are constantly reviewing things to make sure the owners haven't changed, the process hasn't changed, the risks haven't changed, maybe the jurisdictions may or may not have changed. So constantly reviewing what's going on, and the owners, mostly the owners, the business process owner has a duty as well to make sure they update us if anything changes in any event. Now, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but they should know to do that. And some of them will come to us and say, look, we're actually now going to go to this country or that country. We need to review this in light of that. So there's a constant, people know that it's not just put it in the box, forget about it. It's a constant review, ongoing monitoring.
Okay. Anything to add to that, Simon?
Yeah, I think that's the key thing is checking afterwards and seeing also, things can change quite a lot in the first 3 months or so, I find, after projects go live, because quite often projects are, increasingly using kind of minimum viable product sort of situations whereby they'll roll on and develop, and agile methodologies being used. So you have stage 1 and then you have stage 2 and stage 3. So becoming quite ongoing kind of assessments required there. The other thing, if I could just chip in with it, Robert, if that's okay, is the step before that, kind of getting from the stage where you've identified the risk into evaluating the solutions. And I think that's an area which needs a little bit of thought, I guess, around being able to kind of kick the tires on the proposed solutions, because a situation that can happen is that solutions can be proposed that don't actually tackle the risk, or don't do it in the right way, or are maybe structured in the wrong way. And I've found that sometimes people can jump to a conclusion that won't in fact mitigate the risk in the right way. And sometimes also the other thing is the fact sometimes the solution is simpler than people think. Quite often updating your privacy notice, or just changing your access controls, or some things that actually are relatively straightforward can often be the best solution. So don't rule them out. I'd say take a what can be used as solutions to problems. I don't assume it's always going to be complex and difficult, because quite often, actually, in my experience, it's not.
So that leads on to a question that we've got, but so the question we've got is, have you got any ideas on linking up completed DPIAs with the record of processing activities? I'm also going to add, because I think from what Simon's saying, my experience is, as you assess the risk, you're going to go, well, yes, what we need to do here is update the privacy notice. You might be saying what we need to be aware of here is how we're going to manage subject access requests if we're storing whatever data in a different way. So how, Joe, do you see, again, technology helping the 360, for want of a better description, of the ROPA and the notice and the PIA, etc.?
Well, yeah, they're absolutely all connected, and the terminology I use is that it's kind of joined up thinking. So your DPIA will 99% of the time be connected to a process in your records of processing activities, and perhaps then data subject access requests or something is also related to that, and they will all influence your risk. So we need to have all of those things to be able to talk to each other effectively. And when you can do that, then when you come to your process, you can see a record of all the DPIs that have taken place at the outcome of those. And then also, if you need to reassess on an annual or maybe 6 monthly basis, you can take the information you've had already and reuse what's appropriate and overwrite what's not. You're not starting from scratch every single time, which is where the big value is. And if you work with a privacy platform, you get all of those benefits. And just to the point Simon made also earlier about risk and risk mitigation, and those of you studying for some of your privacy exams on privacy technologists, there's loads of questions about this. So a typical one is, we've gathered all this information and we want to do this new process. Is a DPIA required, or what should we do? And a lot of the time, in the scenario, what the organization want to process isn't the personal data. So they could remove the personal data, and that just doesn't really reduce the risk, it removes the risk. So you need to sometimes look a bit more about what you're intending to do and how you need to do it, and what data you need to use. And many scenarios, maybe you don't need personal data at all. So you can mitigate and reduce the risk that way.
Thank you for that. We've had a number of questions about the DCMS consultation on changes, and as we know, one of the things identified was that the UK thinks that the GDPR from an EU perspective is over-engineering, and that maybe we don't need DPOs, and maybe we don't need the extent of DPIAs. I guess all of us on here are probably in the same boat, so to speak. And I suspect I know what Debbie's answer will be, although she might shock me. But do you think it's wise that we should reduce the need for a DPIA, Debbie?
So I think you should make it easier. So, you know, for example, countries have got their white list. Some countries like Spain, Austria, etc., are making it easier for people to figure out what they need and what they don't need. And I think some of the regulators can certainly help, because there is a lot of admin related to this role, quite frankly, which, I'm not sure everybody loves it, that part of the role anyway. So I certainly think there's steps that could be taken to make it easier to do this role, which shouldn't erode any of the fundamental requirements of the existence of this role, which is to protect, individuals' rights and to make sure people behave appropriately, to be the guardians. Yeah. If you took that role away, there is a risk, of course, that the whole thing will fall apart, because, who is actually going to be really bothered? Because, if it was left to, and I'm not saying you can't do dual roles, but some people aren't going to be as vested in it as others if it's not actually their role. I've got a number of people assigned globally who do this on a part-time basis, and some of them might be MD, some of them might be HR people or whatever. And the concern I have there, even though that's the model I have to apply because of resource constraints, sometimes I am concerned that maybe, they won't have the right, focus, which is why, you do need to have somebody who's a little bit more, I suppose, independent from just the commercials, etc., of the business.
Yeah, and intrigued on your views, Joe, on the DCMS proposals around DPIAs being less over-engineered.
I disagree, to be completely honest. I think, as was mentioned, they could be perhaps more efficient or more user-friendly, but I think it's better to start from a robust position than perhaps a weaker position. Also, with regards to GDPR, if you look at legislation that's been rolled out all over the world, like the Thai, Brazilian, South African laws, and some in the Middle East, they're all heavily based on the GDPR, which to my mind says a lot of it is good, robust, and correct. So I wouldn't be in favor of scaling it back, maybe refining it slightly, but I would be concerned to make it maybe weaker. And certainly the role of the DPO, I've seen this in meetings I've been in. There's this wonderful phrase I had from when I did some consultancy for a pharmaceutical company. They called it being voluntold. And where you meet someone who's a DPO who's been voluntold, or who it's not their full-time role, they're often very much not up to speed or not as engaged, perhaps through time constraints, as to someone it is their role, who's going to be more engaged and more helpful and more useful to get things on the way. So I think removing a DPO is I would say maybe even dangerous, and making the process less robust is I would be concerned about that.
I'm conscious of time. We have got another question, but I'd just like Simon's views on the DCMS items?
Yeah, I'll just sum it up quickly because I think Debbie and Joe have covered that nicely. But yeah, I very much support the DPO role, and I think that's a really important role. I think there is a need for maybe a bit more flexibility, but that really comes down a lot to in terms of DPIAs I'm talking here. But that comes down, I think, to how organisations choose to use choose to manage it, and hopefully sessions like this will help organisations to take a more flexible approach and adapt. So I can see the principle in taking some of the pressure off of organisations in terms of DPIAs, but I think they're a very important risk management tool, and many organisations, even if it wasn't the law, would choose to use them, particularly in more risky situations, would just choose to still continue to use the templates and methodology that we use now, assuming, of course, there's a DPO role.
Yeah, and certainly my experience, as Joe's been saying, is on a multinational basis, it's rather odd that we're going in the opposite, or suggesting we're going in the opposite direction to other countries that are very GDPR influenced in the new laws that are coming out. It's odd. On that DPO role, there's a question: how detailed does the DPO advice section and advice from internal, external consultation need to be recorded in the DPIA? Joe, I'll go back to you on that one.
So how detailed is the advice? I think it depends on the nature of the process you're assessing and the amount of risk that is potentially flagged that they would need to add. Those are just my thoughts on that.
Okay, and Debbie, any?
Yeah, no, it's a bit of a how long's a piece of string point, really. It really just depends. So, if it's a really complex or high risk activity, you're probably going to have to put a bit more detail there and show you've put a bit more thought into it. If it's something fairly straightforward, obviously you can probably put a fairly straightforward response back. So just take each one as you find them.
Okay.
I think if I can just add, it also depends on the amount of measures and controls that you've got in place to protect against that risk. If you've got some great measures that are protecting from a risk, your comment probably doesn't need to be too big. But if you've got some, residual level of risk that's going to be there, if there's a high risk that you can't mitigate, the kind of thing that might lead to a consultation, clearly it's going to need a bit more description.
Yep. We've got about 2 minutes to go before we get to the hour. I just wondered I'm looking at questions. There's no more coming in at the moment. So I wondered, I'll start with you, Debbie. Do you have any sort of closing words of wisdom for everybody on the call?
Yeah. So put a fairly, I wouldn't say simple process, but make sure you get a process in place that uses helpful templates. I don't, again, sorry, plugging OneTrust. OneTrust are like, this is fantastic. They didn't pay me to come here, by the way. But you don't have to use them. You can create your own. But, use a template that will help you. And that template can drive short or long responses, light touch, whatever, but have a very simple process in place that allows for variations depending on the risks and the controls that need to be put in place. And obviously, get buy-in. This isn't something you can just talk to people about today and forget about it tomorrow. You have to constantly talk about it, remind people, always, remind them about the need for the process, etc. So don't give up. Keep going, guys.
Okay, and Joe?
I think you need to consider how many of these you're going to be doing, maybe on an annual basis. And if it's one, then maybe you can get by with whatever it is you've put together. But if you're going to have to do this frequently and you're going to have to review, then maybe consider a solution. And also a point that's come up a lot today when trying to get buy-in from the executive board, compliance on its own isn't that exciting. It's like insurance. It's kind of necessary, but it's not exciting. So try and impress upon your executive team the other value you get, the insights from the data, the protection you get, and that you're building an organization of trust, which you can use with your partners and also your customers.
Okay, and Simon?
Yeah, just agree with both of all the points that you've raised there. But the only thing I'd add, I guess, is trying to speak the language of the people that you're talking to. Try and cut out the jargon. Try and just bring it back to, use words that people will understand. Don't put the jargon into it. Relate it to the kind of the projects and the roles that they have. Help them to understand the privacy risks. That's the key thing I find, is just helping people to recognise what a privacy risk looks like and what could go wrong. And then I'm always in favour of helping get involved in evaluating the solutions. As I've said, I think that's an important thing. So those would be my tips.
Thank you to all three of you. I see that there's one or two questions that I didn't specifically flag, but as it happens, we sort of covered, I think, the answers. So I can see some very nice comments about how useful people have found it. I think that's all from me, but I'm going to hand back to Simon in case there's any closing admin items. Simon?
Yeah, just one actually, Robert. And I saw the question, is the recording going to be available? Yes, it is. Yeah. So if you didn't catch all of this, then yes, the recording is going to be available. We have recorded the whole thing. So around about 4 p.m. GMT tomorrow, you should get an email with a copy of the recording if there's anything else you want to view again. And I hope you've all found it useful. Thanks ever so much for coming along to this DPN event. Thanks to our sponsor, OneTrust. Thanks to all of you guys. Thanks to Robert. Thanks to Debbie too, and Joe.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.